Thank you very much, all. Fascinating topic, in many ways culmination not just of this conference, but also of so many of the headlines that we've been reading over the past years. This notion that we have moved into a new global order that will be defined by fundamental competition between major powers. How that competition evolves, how we define those powers, how we choose to engage together or not in responding to global challenges, that's what we're going to talk about over the next 30+ minutes. I want to start off with Tony and ask, when you look at the mood music of the United States and China, at least over the course of the last few weeks, we've seen at least a pullback from the idea of a new Cold War. Do you think anything fundamental has changed or is changing between the United States and China?
I think the fundamental answer is fundamentally no. But I do think what the West is trying to search for is the right relationship with China, which, as you say, will be the defining relationship, certainly of this part of the 21st century, in circumstances where people acknowledge that China is a power, has a rightful place as a power. They understand that, for example, on issues like climate change, there isn't a solution without the engagement of China. But at the same time, there is anxiety about China as a threat. And therefore, I would characterize what I think the West is searching for, and I don't think this is defined very clearly yet, but I would characterize it as one that will come eventually to maximum engagement, but with superior strength. In other words, that people will understand that you have to engage with China, whether it's on climate or pandemics or the stability of the global economy, but at the same time, recognizing that China has taken a different path in the last few years, has become more internally repressive, more externally aggressive. I think the West will want to retain superiority militarily, in technology, and on the economy. And my guess is that ultimately, although many people might disagree with this, Europe, and for these purposes I include the United Kingdom, Europe will want to be ultimately in systemic terms with the US.
So, Madam Secretary, I just heard from Tony, maximum engagement, but with superior strength. When you think about this from the American perspective, looking what the Biden administration is doing right now, do you think that's where we're heading, and do you think that's the right way to define it?
Well, I think that is a big part of what the Biden administration is attempting to lay out. We've seen that in recent months with the move to bring together the Quad and try to create, a very visible alliance of democratic nations in the region to be part of an overall effort to make clear to China that, of course, we have to cooperate. We should cooperate on a range of issues, but we also cannot permit the kind of aggressive military buildup, the kind of efforts to dominate maritime navigation, the intimidation of nations in the larger Asia-Pacific region. And we also have seen a very serious and important defense move by the United States, the UK, and Australia to buttress Australia as a strong partner in a superior military presence. So the Biden administration, at least from the public efforts that have been going on, is trying to strike that balance that we heard President Biden express in his recent virtual summit with President Xi Jinping. I think that a lot of what will happen in the region depends upon how other nations perceive the competition. And that is not only within Asia, but also further afield in Europe, in Africa, even Latin America, because other nations will also have to make the determination as to how they engage in cooperation with China, cooperation with the United States and our allies, and how they maximize their own interests in the midst of this very clear and growing competition between the United States and China.
Thank you. So, Jay, we've heard from a lot of people, a lot of countries around the world that the United States is inconsistent. We don't know if we can count on them. We don't know what their Asia policy looks like. Haven't heard that from India. Mm-hmm. From the Indian perspective, the relationship with the United States has been getting stronger under the last 2 administrations.
Last 5.
I mean, no question. But I mean, since we've been talking about great power competition. So I'm wondering, from where you sit today, do you see the U.S. China relationship as fundamentally more problematic today? Do you think the United States is a more comfortable partner for India, a partner you can rely on more?
Okay, look, let me give you a somewhat structural answer. I think there's no question that the United States has been strategically contracting for some time. Don't confuse it with the decline of the United States. I think that's ridiculous. But relatively and absolutely, American power, American influence is not what it used to be. It's also clear China has been expanding, but China, the nature of China, the manner of its growing influence is very different from the United States. And we don't have a situation where China necessarily replaces the United States. Now, while it's natural to think of China, U.S. China as the overarching happening, the fact is there are also a lot of other countries, including India, but not just India, which have come much more into play. There's been a rebalancing in the world. I think different countries have different weightages. So in a sense, the landscape has changed. It's become more volatile. The players have multiplied. We tend to find much more localized fixes. Secretary Clinton referred to the Quad. It's a good example of some countries coming together on a certain set of concerns or issues or interests. So the long answer to your question is the United States is a much, I've been dealing with the United States close to 40 years now, maybe more. And the United States is today a much more a flexible partner, much more open to ideas, suggestions, working arrangements than in the past. I think this reflects a very different kind of world we are moving into. A world, in a sense, you could say, the real transitions after 1992 are now occurring. And we are heading for a fairly long period of uncertainty, volatility, but creativity. So for my business, it's very challenging.
Now, Madam Secretary, I noticed in your comments about what the United States is doing in this part of the world, you talked about the Quad, you talked about AUKUS, those are obvious successes for the U.S. You didn't talk a lot about trade policy, in part because we don't have a lot of trade policy in this part of the world. And when I think about CPTPP, I think about RCEP, the 2 largest multilateral trade agreements in the world, and the United States is not part of either of them. How much of a problem is that? Again, I know when you were Secretary of State, you were tried to move in a very different direction, but how much of a hole is that? And how do you think in this domestic and international environment, we should try to address it?
Ian, that's a really important question. And I probably would have answered it differently a few years ago than I'm about to answer it tonight, because I think circumstances have changed rather significantly. What I think we're going to be seeing as we are now and have ever since the eruption of the pandemic is nations, particularly the United States, but others as well, are going to be really focusing inward on their own internal production and manufacturing base for all kinds of necessities. The problems with the supply chain that has been revealed, first with the difficulties getting PPE during the pandemic, now with the backlog of practically everything, with container ships, backed up as they are, certainly at American ports, means there's going to be increasing pressure internally in the United States to be more self-sufficient when it comes to certain necessities. Now, obviously, we're going to continue to be a trading nation, and it would be in our interests to take a hard look at how best to maximize this rather interesting development of how we make sure we have adequate supply within our own country, within our own hemisphere, for example, that is not dependent upon long-haul trade, not dependent upon whatever decision might be made or whatever economic shock might occur inside China, but also, again, going back to this idea of balancing, and sometimes balancing what used to be contradictory impulses, so that we are engaged in trade, both in a positive way, but also in a way that tries to make greater advantage for the United States, for our allies, in setting up new supply chains, in looking at new kinds of relationships. I'm not sure that even some of the multilateral agreements that we're not in, that were negotiated 10 years ago and longer, are going to be adequate for how countries such as ours and others are seeing the economic challenges that we face. So trade, yes, but trade how defined? Trade combined with more internal changes in our own economies, looking carefully at what's happening inside China, both some of the consequences of overheating or overextension, plus some of the decisions made by the government and the party there to really clamp down on certain manufacturers, to begin to be much more difficult with American companies. We're going to have to take a hard look at what are the new facts now in the global economy and how best we can manage those for our own benefit and the benefit of our friends and allies.
So let's stipulate that Secretary Clinton's views have evolved on U.S. and trade in this region and globally. We haven't talked much about Europe yet. I want to bring Europe in now. The United States, from a military lens, a national security lens, dominant player still around the Pacific. With the exception of the UK and France, the Europeans see it very, very different. How do you think the Europeans play a role with the United States and not with the United States vis-a-vis China? Where is that now, and where do you think it's evolving?
Well, I think Europe at a very fundamental level is going to want to stay with the United States. And I think Europe will not want to be seen or want to start navigating between China and the US as if they were equidistant. But I think, Hillary made a really important point here, and I'm not sure, she can answer for herself, but I'm not sure it's so much that her views have evolved as the facts have changed. It is true that now there are certain supply chain issues that mean that you've got to look at things differently. But what I think would be a huge mistake is if the world goes protectionist, turns its back on the basic and fundamental principles of open trade, which are a good thing. I mean, if you take Britain, for example, having come out of the European Union, I don't want to revisit whether that decision was right or wrong, but the immediate consequence has been a drop of imports 15% down from Europe, exports 15% down in respect of Europe. This is not a good thing for your economy. So ultimately, I think that people will, in Europe, they'll want to be pragmatic around issues like trade. I think in terms of security, though, they will be very much with the United States. Ultimately, that's not to say that, and all nations at the moment are trying to work out how do we keep the relationship with China without offending the United States. Every place you go, the leadership will say, tell me how to get out of this one, basically. But what I say to them is, it may seem contradictory to have this idea that, you know, there is a degree of confrontation because of some of the things that China's doing, at the same time as you have this space for cooperation. But in the end, you're just trying to make sense of reality. And I think the best way to look at it is that when you get to really deep relationships, you know, relationships that go, as I say, systemically, they're about the actual institutions of countries. I can't see the UK, for example, or any of the leading European nations departing from that American alliance. I think what will be really interesting in time is to see how our relations in Europe, UK's relations also with India, evolve and develop. And I think one of the interesting things, and maybe this is not accurate to put it in this way, but and Jay will tell us if it's not, but I think India's policy has also evolved over these last years, because, you know, when you get to the middle of this century, you will have America and China as two big giants, but you'll probably have a third giant that is India.
Well, Jay's going to tell you that the facts have evolved in terms of China, and I'm going to get to that in 1 second. But since you raised the question of what we need to do in terms of business, we don't want to go protectionist, I want to ask you, Hillary, one very quick question, which is, given that we're discussing right now in the United States whether or not, I mean, inflation is very high, do you think it's a good idea or not for the U.S. and China, if they could mutually agree, to remove the tariffs that were added under the Trump administration?
Well, I think Ian, that there should be an effort to reconsider all of the tariffs. You know, some of them have hurt us and maybe hurt us for, you know, for the foreseeable future, particularly in agricultural goods. Some of them, you know, are more technical, and whether or not you would take it all off or you would modify them. But I know that that's going on. I know that there is an ongoing process as we speak to try to figure out what would be the best approach with respect to the tariffs. And I would predict that there will be some changes, but they will not all disappear because some of them in this new reality we're living in may well be continued.
Market positive indicator from Madam Secretary. Just want to make sure everyone heard that. So, Jay, you heard from Tony. One of the countries in the world that, in a sense, has shifted most dramatically in the last few years has been where Delhi is, and a lot of that is a response to China. I'm kind of interested, do you think that the Chinese government is aware of how, frankly, badly they've mishandled their bilateral relationship with a country which has historically been non-aligned and is now a part of the Quad and is increasingly finding China and its national security orientation objectionable?
Well, I don't agree with the way you framed the question.
Change it. Feel free.
But I don't think the Chinese have any doubt on where we stand on our relationship and what's not gone right with it. I've been meeting my counterpart Wang Yi a number of times. As you would have experienced, Ian, I speak fairly clearly, reasonably understandably. There's no lack of clarity. So if they want to hear it, I'm sure they would have heard it. But the issue of where is India positioned, look, yes, some of it is about China because they are our neighbor and we're going through a particularly bad patch in our relationship because they've taken a set of actions in violation of agreements for which they still don't have a credible explanation. And that appears to indicate some rethink about where they want to take our relationship, but that's for them to answer. But it's not just about China, because if we come back to your first question and you know what Secretary Clinton and Tony were speaking about, the world is changing. The world is changing. It's certainly not unipolar. It's not really bipolar either. I mean, there are many more players. So a lot of what we are doing in terms of repositioning, working with countries in, you know, the term we all like to use as multipolar world, is really, in a sense, it's a kind of partly a hedging strategy, partly autonomous partnerships, often very issue-based, so you work with different countries on different sets of issues. And my sense is the last 2 years have accelerated that trend, because what the COVID has done is it's called into question the old model of globalization. So we are moving from a sort of just-in-time globalization to a just-in-case globalization. Countries are willing to pay additional costs for a greater sense of security. We all want more reliable, more resilient supply chains. We want more options. I mean, many of us, and we were in touch during that period, went through very difficult issues. It could have been on health. It could have been even in some cases on food. So we are actually at multiple levels in a very, very complex transition. The transition, some of it is with the rise and fall and the rebalancing of powers. Some of it is many more players. Some of it is our concept of what is national security has changed. We think much more of economic security, much more of health security, much more of digital security. The need, in the old days, it didn't matter to us beyond a point what your domestic system was. Today, issues of trust and transparency are much more relevant in a data-driven world. So it does matter to me what the character of my partner is, who I partner with. So these are all new factors which I would suggest is really taking the world in a very, very different direction. And obviously, India would like to sort of stay on top of its game and see how its interests are best served. And those interests today are definitely served with a much closer relationship with the United States, with a much stronger relationship with Europe and the UK, with a very, I would say, a re-energizing of our relationship with the ASEAN, especially Singapore. So all of that is happening.
Do you think, Tony, I mean, you've talked about this a lot historically, that there is a fundamentally ideological dimension to the emergence of a new, increasingly multi-power, polar global order?
Yeah, but it's the difference in the end when you're trying to work out what your foreign policy should be. And sometimes it's really helpful in politics not to think as a politician, but just as a person. Right, when I look at the system under which we live in the UK, I can see all sorts of faults with it, but there are certain freedoms that come with that system that I like, right? And that's what I want to live under. Okay. Now, I can look at the Chinese system and I can really admire the extraordinary economic progress, the ability to build the country, to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But I'm in no doubt, ultimately, as a person, fundamentally, I want to live under our system and not their system. And that, in the end, is what unites us with a country like India, because India is, the world's largest democracy. So these are important values that ultimately bind people together. Now, that's not to say that you don't pay attention to your interests. Of course you do. And that's why I'm saying you're going to have a pragmatic engagement with China. But the great hope that many of us had when I was in office, certainly, that as China evolved economically, it would evolve politically, and not to a Western democracy, but would evolve in the sense of greater openness, that the Communist Party in China would see its future somewhat differently. You've got to be very honest about that. In the last years, that's changed. The Communist Party's retightened its grip completely, and there's a more nationalist rhetoric and action that comes out of the Chinese leadership. So this is why I think it's, one of the things that people, and I think this is really important for America, is that, America's got to still be really confident about its own values and system, despite all the problems. And I know America's got huge political challenges, and it's been a very divided politics. And I hope that in time that politics can come back together, because the world needs a more unified American political system, because it needs a more consistent American policy. But in the end, let's never forget, it's a great test of a country. Are people trying to get into it or out of it? You know, I always say if you want to analyze how your country is doing, the problem for Britain is immigration. The problem for America is immigration. That's because people want to get into it. They don't want to get into it just for a better life in terms of prosperity, because there's something about freedom, liberty, rule of law that people admire and they like. So this is why I think that in the end, with all of this, it requires a lot of I think, sensitivity and intelligence and wisdom in the statecraft. But the way I see this century unfolding is ultimately being able to strengthen the alliance of those countries, America, Europe, and I would include India in this, Japan, obviously, and the democracies of the world, recognizing that there is something profound they have in common, that whilst we have to deal with the rise of China and engage with it in the way that I've described, we shouldn't forget that that underlying value system is important, it unifies us, and it's worth standing up for.
So we're thirds of the way through here, and we haven't brought up Russia at all. And I want to do that now, in part because of the ideological point that we just discussed. It's not a democracy. Another country that we thought after 91 might become one certainly hasn't. But also because we just had Dr. Kissinger joining us, and he's someone who still says pretty strongly that the Americans need to engage more with the Russians because they're going to have problems with China long term. Hillary, do you think, I mean, you're someone that tried to engage the Russians for quite a while, and it's been challenging. Do you think that beyond the Biden meeting with Putin in Geneva, that there is more strategically that the Americans should try to be doing realistically with Putin in this Kremlin? Or at this point, is it just stabilize the relationship and move on?
Well, I think, part of statecraft is continuing to look for ways to engage. And I certainly have seen and expect to see that coming from the Biden administration. But I have heard for years that, Russia would become more willing to move toward the West, more willing to engage in a positive way with Europe, the UK, the US, because of problems on its border, because of the rise of China. And, we haven't seen that. Instead, what we've seen is a concerted effort by Putin maybe to hug China more with the hope that it would stave off some of the potential problems that could come, especially in their Far East. But Russia raises a different set of questions that I think we have got to start paying greater attention with. Part of the way that Putin has exercised power is through networks of non-state actors. He has a very large mercenary force that has been operating everywhere from Syria to the Central African Republic. He has a very large stable of hackers and those who deal in disinformation and cyber warfare, both in and outside of the government. He's engaged in a lot of asymmetric power moves. And I think one of the areas that nation states have got to pay greater attention to is the rise of these asymmetric power centers. Some of them operate either with the approval or even in full cooperation with state actors, like you see with the Kremlin. Some of them are independent, but we're going to be facing increasing challenges. The way that technology has developed, the incredible use of disinformation in the political sphere and the economic sphere is only going to get worse. The rise of artificial intelligence is going to threaten nation states, going to threaten multinational corporations. And then one more area that I hope nation states start paying greater attention to is the rise of cryptocurrency, because what looks like a very interesting and somewhat exotic effort to literally mine new coins in order to trade with them has the potential for undermining currencies, for undermining the role of the dollar as the reserve currency, for destabilizing nations, perhaps starting with small ones, but going much larger. So when we think about this new environment in which we find ourselves that we've been discussing for the last some minutes, we can't just think about nation states. And Putin is a great example of that because with his oligarchic coterie, he has utilized many non-state actors to pursue personal as well as nationalistic goals. And I think that's going to become a greater and greater threat. And it appears as though China is going to prevent outside technology payment systems like the cryptocurrency development from playing a big role inside China, because I think they've recognized, given their nationalism, perhaps earlier than other nations in the U.S., Europe, elsewhere, that this could be a direct threat to sovereignty. So while we're talking about making decisions and trying to be strategic and building alliances, there's a whole new layer of activity that could be extremely destabilizing, and in the wrong hands or in alliances with the wrong people could be direct threats to many of our nation states and certainly to the global currency markets.
Look, I think the crypto through a geopolitical lens tells you so much about the different orientations towards the global order of the Chinese and the Russians. And there's a lot more of that when you talk about new technology spaces. Before we turn to Afghanistan and bring our next guest on, Jay, I wanted to ask you something. You probably didn't expect this question, but India raised an eyebrow. India has been both the epicenter of COVID cases and outbreak, and increasingly going to be the epicenter of vaccine production and export. I'm wondering, over the last 2 years, what have you learned new about the geopolitical order from India's experience in COVID and the pandemic?
I think the biggest lesson from that would be that we should have done a better job building over many, many years, building our own capacities. And in a sense, under Prime Minister Modi, we have a program which basically translates into self-reliant India. At the time when COVID hit us, we had two companies which were assembling ventilators. We had there was no N95 mask producer. Again, we used to get those valves from outside and make it. There was very little medical equipment. So what has happened is, during that period, we have scaled up enormously. I mean, today when I look at what actually the health infrastructure which has grown up in response to COVID, I mean, we have literally set up thousands of COVID treatment centers which will outlast COVID, hopefully. So you had a transformation on the health sector, and we have shown by a combination of digital tools and greater production capacities that it is possible for a country which has a per capita income of less than $2,000 to actually reach out in a very, very massive way in public health. The second takeaway for us is the positive takeaway, which is if you see why has India become a major vaccine production center? Why is it that you have some vaccines, the same vaccine is being produced in multiple countries, but the Indian plants have a very high, very efficient result? I think the quality of HR, the skills out there, the practices, traditions, a lot of that has really been brought to bear on the COVID issue. it's grown. And, if I look not just at vaccines, I look at the pharma world as a whole. I mean, there was a time when hydroxychloroquine was very much in demand, or paracetamol was in demand. And you actually had a sort of scaling up of 10x, even 15, 20x for different medicines. So it's been a test for us. Obviously, a lot of it was about our own survival, our own responses. But I think we've come out of it very strong enough to be much more relevant for global public health needs. It's interesting, one of the initiatives under the Quad is to sort of jointly produce and distribute a Quad vaccine. Which would be an American vaccine made in India, and the Japanese will come in with a lot of financial support, and the Australians with a lot of logistics support. Again, for me, it's both a decentralized globalization, more resilient, reliable supply chains, more trust and transparency, but also this more flexible combinations which sit down and produce solutions for particular challenges. I think it's a very good illustration of all of them.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to express our appreciation both to Secretary Clinton and to Minister of External Affairs Jaishankar for joining us.